This is part 2 of the audiobook, Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by English author Jane Austen, originally published in 1813. It is a novel of manners that follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist, who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and has inspired many derivatives in modern literature. In this audiobook, the original Pride and Prejudice has been reimagined as if it had been originally written by best-selling New York Times and USA Today author Carolyn Brown. Carolyn Brown has written more than 100 novels and 8 novellas, and contributed to multiple anthologies, selling more than 6 million copies. We hope you enjoy this classic book, reimagined. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us what you like about this reimagined book, or what you think we need to do better next time. Thanks for watching and listening.
Drawing room drama. After dinner, when the ladies left the table, Elizabeth hurried to check on Jane. Assured her sister was warm enough, she escorted her into the drawing room. There, Jane was warmly welcomed by Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, who were unusually pleasant. For the next hour their conversation was lively, filled with anecdotes and laughter, making them appear more agreeable than ever before. But when the gentlemen joined them, the dynamic shifted. Miss Bingley's attention was immediately drawn to Mr. Darcy. He greeted Jane with polite congratulations, while Mr. Hurst made a brief, indifferent bow. However, it was Bingley who showed genuine warmth and joy, fussing over Jane and ensuring she was comfortable by the fire, talking to her almost exclusively. Elizabeth watched this with delight from her corner, busying herself with some needlework. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst suggested setting up the card table, but Miss Bingley, having learned that Mr. Darcy didn't want to play, assured him that no one was interested. The group's silence on the matter confirmed her statement, leaving Mr. Hurst to stretch out on a sofa and nap. Darcy picked up a book, Miss Bingley followed suit, and Mrs. Hurst, while fiddling with her bracelets and rings, occasionally joined in Bingley's conversation with Jane. Miss Bingley, more interested in Darcy's reading than her own, kept trying to engage him, but he responded minimally, focused on his book. Exhausted by her attempts, she finally yawned and remarked, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening reading. Truly, there's no enjoyment like it. When I have my own house, I'll be miserable without a great library." No one replied, so she yawned again, discarded her book, and searched for amusement. Hearing Bingley mention a ball to Jane, she interjected, "Charles, are you serious about a dance at Netherfield? You should consult everyone's wishes first. Some might find it more a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," her brother retorted, "he can go to bed before it begins. The ball is settled, and once Nichols makes enough white soup, I'll send out the invitations." "I'd prefer balls if they were more conversational and less about dancing," Miss Bingley mused. "That might be rational, Caroline, but it wouldn't be much like a ball," Bingley laughed. Miss Bingley, undeterred, stood and walked about, her elegant figure and graceful walk aimed at catching Darcy's attention. But he remained engrossed in his book. Desperate, she turned to Elizabeth. "Miss Eliza Bennet, won't you join me for a walk around the room? It's so refreshing." Surprised, Elizabeth agreed. Miss Bingley's true aim was achieved. Darcy looked up, closed his book, and watched them. He was invited to join, but declined, suggesting that their motives for walking were either secret affairs or to show off their figures, and his presence would be intrusive. Curious, Miss Bingley asked Elizabeth if she understood him. "Not at all," Elizabeth replied, "but he's likely being severe. The best way to disappoint him is to ask nothing more." Miss Bingley, however, insisted on an explanation. Darcy, willing to clarify, said they either walked to discuss secrets or to display their figures, and he could admire them better from the fire. "Shocking!" Miss Bingley cried. "How should we punish him?" "Easily," said Elizabeth. "Tease him, laugh at him. You know how to do it." "I don't. My intimacy hasn't taught me that. Teasing calmness and presence of mind. Impossible. And laughter without a subject. Mr. Darcy would win." "Mr. Darcy isn't to be laughed at," Elizabeth exclaimed. "It would be a great loss to have many such acquaintances. I love a good laugh. Miss Bingley credits me with too much, Darcy said. The wisest and best actions can be ridiculed by those who live for a joke. True, Elizabeth agreed, but I hope I never mock what is wise or good. Follies and nonsense amuse me, and I laugh at them when I can, but these, I suppose, are what you lack. No one is without them, Darcy admitted, but I've always tried to avoid those weaknesses that invite ridicule. Such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness, but pride, where there's real superiority, is always under control. Elizabeth hid a smile. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, Miss Bingley said. What's the result? Mr. Darcy has no defects, Elizabeth replied. He admits it himself. No, Darcy corrected. I have faults, but not of understanding. My temper is too unyielding. I can't forget others' follies and offences quickly. My feelings aren't easily swayed. My temper might be called resentful. Once I lose my good opinion, it's lost forever. That is a failing, Elizabeth cried. Implacable resentment is a flaw, but I can't laugh at it. You're safe from me. Everyone has a natural defect, Darcy said, which education can't overcome. And yours is to hate everyone. And yours, he smiled, is to misunderstand them. Let's have some music, Miss Bingley suggested, tiring of the conversation. Louisa, will you mind waking Mr. Hurst? Her sister didn't object, and the piano was opened. Darcy, after some reflection, wasn't sorry. He realised he might be paying Elizabeth too much attention. Chapter 12. The Unplanned Departure. The next morning, as agreed upon by the sisters, Elizabeth penned a letter to their mother, requesting the carriage be sent for them that day. However, Mrs. Bennet, who had counted on her daughters staying at Netherfield until the following Tuesday to complete Jane's week, was not pleased. Her reply was far from what Elizabeth had hoped for, as she was eager to return home. Mrs. Bennet informed them they couldn't have the carriage before Tuesday, and added in a postscript that if Mr. Bingley and his sister insisted they stay longer, she could easily spare them. Determined not to overstay their welcome, Elizabeth urged Jane to ask Mr. Bingley for the use of his carriage immediately. Eventually, they decided to stick to their original plan of leaving that morning and made their request known. This caused a flurry of polite regrets, with enough insistence that they stay until the following day to sway Jane. Their departure was postponed until the morrow. Miss Bingley soon regretted suggesting the delay. Her jealousy and dislike of Elizabeth far outweighed any affection for Jane. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, was genuinely sorry to see them leave so soon and repeatedly tried to persuade Jane that she wasn't well enough to travel. But Jane, knowing she was well enough, remained firm. To Mr. Darcy, the news of their departure was a relief. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough, and she attracted him more than he liked. Miss Bingley's uncivil behaviour towards Elizabeth and her increased teasing of him added to his discomfort. Determined to show no sign of admiration, he resolved to be particularly guarded, ensuring nothing he did would give Elizabeth hope of influencing his happiness. He spoke barely 10 words to her all Saturday, and, even when left alone with her for half an hour, kept his nose buried in a book and avoided looking at her. On Sunday, after morning service, the much-anticipated separation occurred, pleasing almost everyone. Miss Bingley's politeness towards Elizabeth increased rapidly, as did her affection for Jane. When they parted, she assured Jane of the pleasure it would always give her to see her at either Longbourn or Netherfield, and embraced her warmly. She even shook hands with Elizabeth. Elizabeth left Netherfield in high spirits. Their return home, however, was met with little enthusiasm from their mother. Mrs. Bennet, puzzled by their early return, thought they were wrong to cause such inconvenience, and was certain Jane would catch another cold. Mr. Bennet, though not overly expressive, was genuinely glad to see them. Their absence had made him realise their importance in the family. The evening conversation, once everyone was assembled, lacked the liveliness and sense it had when Jane and Elizabeth were present. They found Mary, as usual, deeply engrossed in her studies of thorough bass and human nature, ready to share new extracts and moral observations. Catherine and Lydia, on the other hand, had more exciting news. Much had happened in the regiment since Wednesday. Several officers had dined with their uncle, a private had been flogged, and there were rumours that Colonel Forster was getting married. Chapter 13. The Unexpected Guest. The next morning at breakfast, Mr. Bennet addressed his wife with a sly smile. "I hope, my dear, you've planned a good dinner today, because we're expecting an addition to our family party." "Who do you mean?" Mrs. Bennet asked, curiosity piqued. "I don't know of anyone coming, unless Charlotte Lucas drops by. I think my dinners are good enough for her. She doesn't see such meals at home often." "The person I'm referring to is a gentleman and a stranger," Mr. Bennet replied. Mrs. Bennet's eyes lit up. "A gentleman and a stranger. It must be Mr. Bingley. Jane, you sly thing, why didn't you mention this? Well, I'll be delighted to see Mr. Bingley, but, good heavens! There's no fish to be found today. Lydia, ring the bell. I need to speak to Hill right away." "It's not Mr. Bingley," Mr. Bennet interjected. "It's someone I've never met before." This revelation sparked a flurry of questions from his wife and daughters. After amusing himself with their curiosity for a while, he explained, "About a month ago, I received a letter from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I'm gone, can turn you all out of this house as he pleases." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Bennet cried, "I can't bear to hear that. Why talk about such an odious man? It's the hardest thing that your estate is entailed away from your own children. If I were you, I'd have done something about it long ago." Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain the nature of an entail once more, but it was a subject beyond Mrs. Bennet's understanding. She continued to lament the unfairness of it all, railing against the idea of 5 daughters losing their home to a man no one cared about. "It certainly is a most unfair affair," Mr. Bennet agreed. "But if you listen to his letter, you might soften a bit towards him." "No, I won't. It was impertinent of him to write at all. Why couldn't he keep quarrelling with you like his father did?" "He seems to have had some filial scruples on that point," Mr. Bennet said, unfolding the letter. "Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent, the 15th of October. Dear Sir, the disagreement between you and my late honoured father always troubled me. Since his passing, I've wished to mend that breach, but I feared it might seem disrespectful to his memory to befriend someone he disliked. My mind is now settled. Having been ordained at Easter, I'm fortunate to be under the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who has appointed me to a valuable rectory. As a clergyman, I feel it my duty to promote peace in all families, hence my current overture of goodwill. I trust you will overlook the entail of the Longbourn estate, and not reject my offered olive branch. I regret the inconvenience to your daughters, and offer my apologies. If acceptable, I propose visiting on Monday, November 18th, and staying until the following Saturday. Lady Catherine permits my absence provided another clergyman covers my duties. Yours respectfully, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, we can expect this peacemaking gentleman, Mr. Bennet said, folding the letter. He seems polite and conscientious. Lady Catherine might even let him visit us again. There's some sense in what he says about the girls, Mrs. Bennet admitted. If he's willing to make amends, I won't discourage him. Though it's hard to guess how he plans to make it up to us, Jane added. But the thought does him credit. Elizabeth was struck by his deference to Lady Catherine and his eagerness to perform his clerical duties. He must be quite an oddity. What can he mean by apologizing for being next in line for the entail? He can't help it. No, my dear, Mr. Bennet said. I think he's quite the opposite of sensible. There's a mix of civility and self-importance in his letter that promises to be entertaining. I can't wait to meet him. His letter isn't poorly composed, Mary noted. The olive branch metaphor might not be new, but it's well expressed. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer was of interest. Their cousin wouldn't be wearing a red coat, and it had been weeks since they'd enjoyed the company of a man in any other colour. Mrs. Bennet, however, was preparing to meet Mr. Collins with surprising composure. Mr. Collins arrived punctually and was greeted with politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet said little, but the ladies were eager to talk. Mr. Collins, a tall, heavy-set young man of 25 with a grave and formal manner, didn't need much encouragement. He complimented Mrs. Bennet on her fine daughters, stating he had heard much of their beauty, but found fame had not done them justice. He added that he did not doubt she would see them all well married. Mrs. Bennet, who never quarrelled with compliments, replied, "You're very kind, sir. I hope it's true. Otherwise, they'll be quite destitute. Things are settled so oddly." "You refer to the entail, I assume?" Mr. Collins asked. "Yes, it's a grievous affair for my poor girls, but I don't blame you. Such things are left to chance." "I understand the hardship for my fair cousins," Mr. Collins said cautiously, "but I assure the young ladies I come prepared to admire them. Perhaps, when we know each other better—" He was interrupted by a summons to dinner. The girls exchanged smiles, amused by Mr. Collins's admiration for everything in the house. His compliments on the hall, dining room, and furniture might have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, if not for the mortifying thought that he viewed it all as his future property. He praised the dinner too, asking which of his cousins was responsible for the excellent cookery. Mrs. Bennet promptly set him straight, asserting that they kept a good cook and her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. Mr. Collins apologized for the misunderstanding, continuing to do so for about a quarter of an hour, until Mrs. Bennet assured him she wasn't offended. Chapter 14. Dinner Discussions and Drawing-Room Delights. During dinner, Mr. Bennet barely spoke a word. But once the servants had cleared the table, he decided it was time to engage his guest in conversation. He chose a topic sure to make Mr. Collins shine, commenting on how fortunate he seemed to be with his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his needs and comfort was remarkable. Mr. Bennet couldn't have chosen better. Mr. Collins was effusive in his praise of Lady Catherine. His demeanour grew even more solemn and important as he extolled her virtues. He declared he had never encountered such affability and condescension from a person of rank. She had graciously approved of his sermons, invited him to dine at Rosings twice, and even asked him to join her for an evening of quadrille. Though many considered Lady Catherine proud, Mr. Collins had only experienced her affability. She treated him as an equal, encouraged his social engagements, and even suggested he marry wisely. She had visited his modest parsonage and approved his improvements, even suggesting a few herself, like adding shelves to the closets upstairs. "That sounds very proper and civil," Mrs. Bennet commented. "She must be a very agreeable woman. It's a pity more great ladies aren't like her. Does she live near you, sir?" "The garden of my humble abode is just across a lane from Rosings Park," Mr. Collins replied. "Is she a widow? Does she have any family?" "She has one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a vast estate." "Ah," Mrs. Bennet said, shaking her head, "then she's better off than many girls. What sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is most charming. Lady Catherine says Miss de Bourgh's beauty surpasses all because it reflects her distinguished birth. Unfortunately, her health is delicate, preventing her from mastering many accomplishments, but she is perfectly amiable, and often drives by my humble abode in her phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented at court? I don't recall her name among the ladies." "Her health keeps her from town, depriving the British court of its brightest ornament, as I told Lady Catherine. Her ladyship appreciated the sentiment. I often offer such compliments, which are always well received. I've told Lady Catherine that her daughter was born to be a duchess and would adorn any elevated rank." "You judge well," Mr. Bennet said. "It's fortunate you have the talent to flatter with such delicacy. Are these compliments spontaneous or planned?" "They mostly arise from the moment, though I sometimes prepare them for ordinary occasions. I strive to make them seem unstudied." Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully met. His cousin was as absurd as he'd hoped, and he listened with keen enjoyment, maintaining a resolute composure. By tea-time, he had had enough and was glad to move to the drawing-room, where he invited Mr. Collins to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins agreed, but when handed a novel from the circulating library, he recoiled and declared he never read novels. Kitty stared, and Lydia exclaimed, "Other books were brought, and Mr. Collins chose Fordyce's Sermons." Lydia yawned as he began reading with monotonous solemnity. After 3 pages, she interrupted, "Do you know, Mamma, Uncle Phillips is thinking of firing Richard. If he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me on Saturday. I'll go to Meryton tomorrow to learn more and find out when Mr. Denny returns from town." Her older sisters told her to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, offended, put down the book. Young ladies show little interest in serious books, even those written for their benefit. It's amazing. Instruction is so advantageous to them, but I won't trouble my young cousin any longer. He turned to Mr. Bennet and suggested a game of backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted, remarking that it was wise to leave the girls to their amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized for Lydia's interruption and promised it wouldn't happen again if Mr. Collins resumed reading. But Mr. Collins assured them he bore no ill will and would never take offence. He joined Mr. Bennet at another table for backgammon. Chapter 15, An Unexpected Arrival. Mr. Collins wasn't exactly a sensible man. His natural deficiencies hadn't been helped much by his upbringing or education. He'd spent most of his life under the thumb of an illiterate, miserly father. Though he attended one of the universities, he did little more than meet the basic requirements and made no useful connections there. His father's oppressive guidance had initially instilled in him a humble demeanour. However, this humility had been largely eroded by the self-importance that came with unexpected prosperity and living in seclusion. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford became vacant. His reverence for her rank, combined with a high opinion of himself and his clerical authority, made him a peculiar mix of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. Now, with a good house and a comfortable income, he intended to marry. Seeking reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he planned to choose one of the daughters as his wife, believing it a generous and suitable atonement for inheriting their father's estate. Seeing the Bennet girls confirmed his plan. Jane's beauty caught his eye, and for the first evening, she was his choice. The next morning, however, a tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast changed his mind. A conversation about his parsonage naturally led to his hopes of finding a wife among the Bennet girls. Mrs. Bennet, with a mixture of smiles and encouragement, hinted that Jane was likely to be engaged soon. Mr. Collins promptly shifted his interest to Elizabeth, who was next in beauty and birth. Mrs. Bennet, delighted, imagined she might soon have 2 daughters married. The man she couldn't stand to hear about the day before was now in her good graces. Lydia's plan to walk to Meryton wasn't forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go, and Mr. Collins, eager to be of use, was asked by Mr. Bennet to accompany them. Mr. Bennet was desperate to reclaim his library, where Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, nominally engaged with a large book, but really talking incessantly about his house and garden at Hunsford. Mr. Bennet's invitation for Mr. Collins to join the walk was both prompt and polite, and Mr. Collins, more suited to walking than reading, was happy to comply. Their walk was filled with Mr. Collins's pompous chatter and the girls' polite responses. But upon reaching Meryton, the younger girls' attention shifted to seeking out the officers. They were soon distracted by a smartly dressed young man they hadn't seen before, walking with Mr. Denny, the very officer Lydia was hoping to inquire about. As they crossed the street under the pretence of visiting a shop, they encountered Mr. Denny and his companion, Mr. Wickham. Mr. Denny introduced Mr. Wickham, who had just joined their regiment. Mr. Wickham's handsome appearance and charming manner captivated the girls, and they were still chatting pleasantly when the sound of horses' hooves drew their attention. Darcy and Bingley were riding down the street. On recognizing the ladies, they approached and exchanged the usual pleasantries. Bingley, focused on Jane, mentioned he was on his way to Longbourn to inquire after her. Darcy, trying to avoid looking at Elizabeth, was arrested by the sight of Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth noticed both men changed colour. One turned white, the other red. Mr. Wickham tipped his hat, which Darcy barely acknowledged. The tension was palpable, and Elizabeth was intrigued but puzzled by the interaction. Bingley, seemingly unaware, soon took his leave with Darcy. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham escorted the ladies to Mr. Phillips's house, declining the invitation to enter despite Lydia's insistence and Mrs. Phillips's enthusiastic support. Mrs. Phillips, always glad to see her nieces, was particularly pleased to welcome the two eldest, surprised at their unexpected return. Her curiosity about their sudden departure from Netherfield was interrupted by Jane's introduction of Mr. Collins. Mrs. Phillips, awed by his politeness, was soon distracted by the other stranger, Mr. Wickham. All she could add was that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he had just secured a lieutenant's commission. Mrs. Phillips promised to invite Mr. Wickham to dine the next day, if the Longbourn family would join them. The prospect of a lively evening, with a bit of hot supper and a noisy game of lottery tickets, cheered everyone, and they parted in good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies for the intrusion, which were met with unceasing civility. As they walked home, Elizabeth recounted to Jane the curious exchange between Darcy and Wickham. Jane, ever ready to defend both gentlemen, was as puzzled as Elizabeth. Mr. Collins, upon his return, greatly pleased Mrs. Bennet by praising Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He declared that, aside from Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never met a more elegant woman. He was particularly impressed by the attention she paid him, despite having no prior acquaintance. Chapter 16. An Evening at Meryton. There were no objections to the young folks spending the evening with their aunt, and Mr. Collins's hesitation about leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening was quickly overruled. The coach carried him and his 5 cousins to Meryton at a suitable hour. The girls were delighted to hear, upon entering the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was already in the house. Mr. Collins took in the room with admiration, struck by its size and furniture. He compared it to the small summer breakfast parlour at Rosings, a comparison that initially seemed unimpressive. But once Mrs. Phillips learned about Rosings and its owner, Lady Catherine, and heard about the grandiosity of just one of Lady Catherine's drawing-rooms, with a chimney-piece costing £800, she fully appreciated the compliment. As Mr. Collins described Lady Catherine's grandeur and the splendour of Rosings, he also slipped in praises of his own modest abode and the improvements he was making. Mrs. Phillips, an attentive listener, was impressed and resolved to share all the details with her neighbours. Meanwhile, the girls, unable to listen to their cousin and with nothing else to do, wished for a musical instrument and inspected the lacklustre china imitations on the mantelpiece. Finally, the gentlemen arrived. When Mr. Wickham entered the room, Elizabeth felt a renewed admiration for him. The officers of the Shire Regiment were a respectable and gentlemanly lot, but Mr. Wickham stood out among them. He outshone even the port-breathing Uncle Phillips, who followed the officers into the room. Mr. Wickham quickly became the centre of attention, especially for the ladies. He seated himself by Elizabeth, and even the mundane topic of the weather became interesting through his engaging manner. With Mr. Wickham and the officers as rivals for the ladies' attention, Mr. Collins seemed insignificant. However, he still had Mrs. Phillips's ear, and was abundantly supplied with coffee and muffins. When the card tables were set up, Mr. Collins obligingly sat down for a game of whist with Mrs. Phillips. "I know little of the game at present," he said, "but I shall be glad to improve, for in my situation in life—" Mrs. Phillips, thankful for his compliance, didn't wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham, not interested in whist, was gladly received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. Initially, Lydia, a determined talker, seemed likely to monopolize him, but her interest in lottery tickets soon absorbed her attention, leaving Mr. Wickham free to talk with Elizabeth. She was eager to hear about his history with Mr. Darcy, but dared not bring it up herself. To her surprise, Mr. Wickham broached the subject. He inquired about Netherfield's proximity to Meryton, and, after learning how long Mr. Darcy had been there, he hesitated before asking how well Elizabeth knew him. "About a month," she said, adding, "He has a large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," Wickham replied, "a clear 10,000 per annum. I've been connected with his family from infancy." Elizabeth was surprised. "You must be astonished," Wickham continued, "given the cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you well acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As much as I ever wished to be," Elizabeth replied. "I think him very disagreeable." "I cannot judge his character," Wickham said. "I've known him too long to be impartial, but your opinion would surprise many. Mr. Darcy is not liked in Hertfordshire. His pride disgusts everyone." "I cannot be sorry for that," Wickham replied, "but the world is blinded by his fortune and rank. He is seen only as he chooses to be seen." "From my brief acquaintance, I'd say he is ill-tempered," Elizabeth remarked. Wickham shook his head. "I wonder if he'll stay long in this country." "I don't know, but I heard nothing of his leaving when I was at Netherfield. I hope his presence won't affect your plans." "Oh no, it's not for me to leave. If anyone should go, it's him. We're not on friendly terms, and it pains me to see him. But I have nothing to hide. His father, the late Mr. Darcy, was the best man and my dearest friend. Seeing this Mr. Darcy grieves me, for his behaviour has been scandalous. I could forgive anything but his disrespecting his father's memory." Elizabeth's curiosity grew, but the delicacy of the subject prevented further questions. Wickham continued with general topics, praising Meryton and its society. "It was the prospect of good society that drew me to the shire. I was brought up for the church, and would have been in possession of a valuable living if it hadn't been for Mr. Darcy." "Indeed?" "Yes, the late Mr. Darcy intended to provide for me. But the living was given to another man, and I can't accuse myself of deserving to lose it. I may have spoken too freely, but we are different men, and he hates me." "This is shocking. He deserves public disgrace," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Some day he will be, but not by me. I can't forget his father." Elizabeth admired his feelings and thought him more handsome than ever. "What could have made him act so cruelly?" she asked. "Jealousy. His father's attachment to me irritated him. He couldn't stand the competition. I never thought Mr. Darcy so bad, though I never liked him. This is malicious revenge." After a pause, Elizabeth continued, "He once boasted of his unforgiving temper. His disposition is dreadful." "I cannot trust myself to speak of him," Wickham replied. Elizabeth, deep in thought, exclaimed, "To treat the godson of his father so!" "Yes," Wickham said, "we were raised together, sharing the same house and amusements. My father devoted himself to Mr. Darcy's service. The late Mr. Darcy promised to provide for me as a debt of gratitude and affection." "How strange and abominable! How could Mr. Darcy not be honest?" "His pride usually leads him to be generous, but he is inconsistent. His pride is sometimes his best friend, connecting him to virtue." "What kind of girl is Miss Darcy?" "She is like her brother, very proud. As a child she was affectionate, but now she's nothing to me. She's a handsome, accomplished girl." Elizabeth returned to the subject. "I am astonished at Mr. Bingley's friendship with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley is so amiable." "Mr. Darcy can be agreeable when he chooses. He is liberal and honourable among his equals, but with the less prosperous his pride shows." The whist game ended, and the players joined the others. Mr. Collins seated himself between Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips, discussing his whist success. Though he lost, he assured Mrs. Phillips it was insignificant, thanks to Lady Catherine's generosity. Mr. Wickham, observing Mr. Collins, asked Elizabeth if her family knew the de Bourghs well. "Lady Catherine recently gave him a living. I don't know how they met," Elizabeth replied. "Lady Catherine and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters. Miss de Bourgh will inherit a large fortune, likely uniting the two estates." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of Miss Bingley's futile hopes. Mr. Collins praises Lady Catherine and her daughter, but I suspect his gratitude misleads him. I believe she is arrogant and conceited, Wickham said. Her reputation is due to her rank and fortune, and her nephew's pride. Elizabeth agreed, and they continued talking pleasantly until supper. Mr. Wickham's manners won everyone over, and Elizabeth left with her mind full of him. She thought of nothing else on the way home, though there was no time to mention him, as Lydia and Mr. Collins talked incessantly. Lydia chattered about lottery tickets, while Mr. Collins praised Mr. and Mrs. Phillips's civility and described supper in detail. By the time the carriage reached Longbourn, Elizabeth's thoughts were still on Mr. Wickham and his story. Chapter 17. Preparations and Invitations. The next day, Elizabeth relayed to Jane what had transpired between her and Mr. Wickham. Jane listened with a mix of astonishment and concern. She found it hard to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, yet she couldn't question the veracity of such an amiable young man as Mr. Wickham. The possibility of him enduring such unkindness tugged at her tender heart. She decided to think well of both men, attributing any misunderstandings to accident or mistake. They must have been deceived somehow, Jane said, her voice gentle. Perhaps others have misrepresented each to the other. It's impossible to guess the causes or circumstances without actual blame on either side. Elizabeth laughed. Well, dear Jane, who do you think could be responsible for such misunderstandings? Do clear them too, or we'll have to think ill of somebody. Jane remained resolute. Laugh if you must, but Mr. Darcy's treatment of his father's favourite is disgraceful. It's impossible to believe that a man of common humanity or any value for his character could act so. Could his friends be so deceived in him? Oh, no. I can more easily believe Mr. Bingley was misled than that Mr. Wickham invented his story. Names, facts, everything was mentioned without hesitation. If it's not true, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in Mr. Wickham's look. It's difficult and distressing. One does not know what to think, Jane admitted. I beg your pardon, I know exactly what to think, Elizabeth said firmly. Jane could only conclude that if Mr. Bingley had been deceived, he would suffer greatly when the truth became known. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Bingley and his sisters, bringing a personal invitation for the long-anticipated ball at Netherfield, scheduled for the following Tuesday. The ladies were delighted to see Jane, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing since they last met. To the rest of the family, they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, and saying little to Elizabeth. The prospect of the Netherfield ball thrilled every female in the Bennet household. Mrs. Bennet saw it as a compliment to Jane, and was flattered to receive the invitation directly from Mr. Bingley. Jane anticipated a happy evening with her friends and Mr. Bingley's attentions. Elizabeth looked forward to dancing with Mr. Wickham and confirming everything in Mr. Darcy's demeanour. Catherine and Lydia were simply excited for a ball, regardless of their dance partners. Even Mary, who preferred solitude, conceded that evening engagements were a necessary social duty. Elizabeth's spirits were so high that she asked Mr. Collins if he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation and join the evening's festivities. To her surprise, he had no reservations about attending. I see no harm in a respectable ball given by a young man of character, Mr. Collins declared. In fact, I hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins throughout the evening, and I would like to solicit yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances. Elizabeth was taken aback. She had hoped to dance those very dances with Mr. Wickham. There was no help for it, though. She had to accept Mr. Collins's proposal with as much grace as she could muster. It now struck her that Mr. Collins might view her as a suitable mistress for Hunsford Parsonage. His increased attentions and frequent compliments confirmed her suspicion. Mrs. Bennet, delighted by the possibility of Elizabeth marrying Mr. Collins, made her approval clear. Elizabeth, however, chose to ignore the hint, knowing it would only lead to a quarrel. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and until he did, there was no point in arguing about it. If not for the upcoming ball, the younger Bennet sisters would have been miserable. From the day of the invitation until the day of the ball, constant rain kept them from walking to Meryton. They missed out on visiting their aunt, seeing the officers, and gathering news. Even the shoe roses for the ball were procured by proxy. Elizabeth might have found the weather trying, as it suspended her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham. But the promise of Tuesday's dance made the rainy days bearable for Kitty and Lydia. Chapter 18. Elizabeth and Jane's Bond. The next day, Elizabeth shared the events between her and Mr. Wickham with Jane. Jane, ever the optimist, listened with a mix of astonishment and concern. She found it hard to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, yet she couldn't question the sincerity of such an amiable young man as Mr. Wickham. The possibility of him enduring such unkindness tugged at her tender heart. She decided to think well of both men, attributing any misunderstandings to accident or mistake. "They must have been deceived somehow," Jane said softly. "Perhaps others have misrepresented each to the other. It's impossible to guess the causes or circumstances without actual blame on either side." Elizabeth laughed. "Well, dear Jane, who do you think could be responsible for such misunderstandings? Do clear them too, or we'll have to think ill of somebody." Jane remained resolute. "Laugh if you must, but Mr. Darcy's treatment of his father's favourite is disgraceful. It's impossible to believe that a man of common humanity or any value for his character could act so. Could his friends be so deceived in him? Oh no. I can more easily believe Mr. Bingley was misled than that Mr. Wickham invented his story. Names, facts. Everything was mentioned without hesitation. If it's not true, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in Mr. Wickham's look." "It's difficult and distressing. One does not know what to think," Jane admitted. "I beg your pardon, I know exactly what to think," Elizabeth said firmly. And Jane could only conclude that if Mr. Bingley had been deceived, he would suffer greatly when the truth became known. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Bingley and his sisters, bringing a personal invitation for the long-anticipated ball at Netherfield, scheduled for the following Tuesday. The ladies were delighted to see Jane, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing since they last met. To the rest of the family, they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, and saying little to Elizabeth. The prospect of the Netherfield ball thrilled every female in the Bennet household. Mrs. Bennet saw it as a compliment to Jane, and was flattered to receive the invitation directly from Mr. Bingley. Jane anticipated a happy evening with her friends and Mr. Bingley's attentions. Elizabeth looked forward to dancing with Mr. Wickham and confirming everything in Mr. Darcy's demeanour. Catherine and Lydia were simply excited for a ball, regardless of their dance partners. Even Mary, who preferred solitude, conceded that evening engagements were a necessary social duty. The ball at Netherfield. The night of the ball, Elizabeth entered the drawing-room at Netherfield, eagerly scanning the room for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of red coats. To her dismay, he was nowhere to be found. She had dressed with more than her usual care, hoping to win over what remained of his heart. A dreadful suspicion crept into her mind. Had Mr. Darcy ensured Wickham's exclusion from the Bingleys' invitation to the officers? Elizabeth's fears were confirmed when Mr. Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied for information, told them that Wickham had been called to town on business and was not expected to return soon. He added, with a significant smile, "I don't think his business would have called him away just now if he hadn't wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." Elizabeth's displeasure with Darcy sharpened with this new confirmation. She could hardly respond civilly to the polite inquiries he made soon after. Elizabeth decided to avoid any conversation with Mr. Darcy, turning away with a degree of ill humour that even affected her interactions with Mr. Bingley, whose blind partiality she found irritating. However, Elizabeth was not one to dwell on ill humour for long. After confiding her grievances to Charlotte Lucas, she managed to shift her focus to the oddities of her cousin, Mr. Collins. The first dances, with Mr. Collins as her partner, were mortifying. His awkwardness and constant apologies made her feel all the shame and misery of having a disagreeable partner. The moment she was released from his company felt like pure ecstasy. She danced next with an officer who provided the welcome distraction of discussing Mr. Wickham, confirming that he was universally liked. Returning to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth found herself unexpectedly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who asked for her hand in the next set of dances. Taken by surprise, she accepted without thinking. She immediately regretted her lack of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her, suggesting that Mr. Darcy might be agreeable. "Heaven forbid!" Elizabeth exclaimed. "To find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate! Do not wish me such an evil!" When the dancing recommenced, Darcy approached to claim her hand. Charlotte whispered a caution to not let her fancy for Wickham make her unpleasant in the eyes of a man of Darcy's consequence. Elizabeth, amazed at her own sudden elevation, stood opposite Mr. Darcy in silence, pondering the reaction of the onlookers. She eventually broke the silence with a slight remark on the dance, prompting a brief exchange. "Is it your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy?" she said. "I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled. "Whatever you wish me to say, I will say." "Very well. That reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but now we may be silent." "Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing?" he asked. "Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. And yet, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible." "Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine?" "Both," replied Elizabeth archly. "We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room and be handed down to posterity." "This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I'm sure," he said. "How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly." "I must not decide on my own performance." Their conversation continued in this vein, until Elizabeth, unable to resist, alluded to Darcy's unforgiving nature. "I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment, once created, was unappeasable." Darcy admitted this with a firm voice, stating that he was cautious in forming resentments and tried not to be blinded by prejudice. Elizabeth, reflecting on the illustration of his character, was unsatisfied by the answer she received. After their dance, Sir William Lucas approached to compliment Mr. Darcy on his dancing and to congratulate Elizabeth. Darcy, distracted by Sir William's reference to a future event involving Bingley and Jane, turned back to Elizabeth, their conversation briefly resuming before he fell silent again. Miss Bingley soon intercepted Elizabeth, making disparaging remarks about Mr. Wickham and warning her not to trust his assertions. Elizabeth, infuriated, dismissed Miss Bingley's interference as mere malice. Elizabeth then sought out Jane, who had been too pleasantly engaged with Mr. Bingley to think much about Wickham. Jane's optimistic view of Mr. Bingley's account of Wickham and Darcy did little to sway Elizabeth's opinion. The rest of the evening brought Elizabeth little amusement. Mr. Collins persisted in his attentions, preventing her from dancing with anyone else. He reassured her that his attentions were meant to recommend himself to her, which Elizabeth found tiresome. Finally, when the Longbourn party was ready to leave, Mrs. Bennet's manoeuvring caused a delay, making their departure linger uncomfortably. Despite the extended goodbyes and the weariness of all involved, Mrs. Bennet remained optimistic about Jane's future with Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth's potential match with Mr. Collins. As they left, Elizabeth felt a mix of relief and frustration. She was determined to focus on Jane's happiness and the bright prospects that lay ahead, even if it meant tolerating the foolishness of her family and the condescension of those who considered themselves superior. Chapter 19. A Proposal and a Refusal. The next day at Longbourn brought a fresh round of excitement. Mr. Collins, determined to declare his intentions without delay, since his leave extended only until the following Saturday, set about his task with the utmost formality and precision, as if it were a business matter to be conducted with the appropriate decorum. After breakfast, he found Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together. Addressing Mrs. Bennet, he said, "May I hope, madam, for your support when I seek a private audience with your fair daughter Elizabeth this morning?" Before Elizabeth could do more than blush with surprise, Mrs. Bennet eagerly responded, "Oh dear, yes, certainly. I am sure Lizzie will be very happy. She can have no objection. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." Gathering her work, she was about to leave when Elizabeth interjected, "Dear ma'am, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself." "No, no, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you to stay where you are," insisted Mrs. Bennet. Seeing Elizabeth's vexed and embarrassed look, she added, "Lizzie, I insist upon your staying and hearing Mr. Collins." Realizing that it would be best to get this over with as quickly and quietly as possible, Elizabeth sat back down, trying to conceal her mixed feelings of distress and amusement. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty left, and Mr. Collins began, "Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, your modesty only enhances your other perfections. I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before my feelings carry me away, let me state my reasons for marrying, and for coming to Hertfordshire to select a wife." The notion of Mr. Collins being swept away by his feelings nearly made Elizabeth laugh, so she let him continue. "My reasons for marrying are, first, that it is right for every clergyman in easy circumstances to set an example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady I call my patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh has twice advised me to marry. She said, 'Mr. Collins, you must marry. Choose a gentlewoman who is useful and not brought up too high.' Her notice and kindness are among the advantages I offer. Your wit and vivacity will be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the respect her rank demands." Mr. Collins continued, "I directed my views to Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, because, as I am to inherit this estate after your honoured father's death, I thought it best to choose a wife from among his daughters. This way the loss will be lessened for them when that sad event occurs, though it may be many years away. This has been my motive, and I flatter myself it will not sink me in your esteem. Now let me assure you of my affection. To fortune I am indifferent. I make no demands on your father, knowing he cannot comply, and I shall never reproach you regarding your dowry. This matter may be considered settled." Elizabeth interrupted, "You are too hasty, sir. I have not answered. I thank you for the compliment, but I must decline." Mr. Collins waved his hand dismissively. "It is usual for young ladies to reject the addresses of the man they secretly mean to accept. I am not discouraged, and hope to lead you to the altar." Elizabeth was astounded. "Upon my word, sir, your hope is extraordinary after my declaration. I assure you I am serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am the last woman in the world who would make you so. Lady Catherine would find me unsuitable." "Lady Catherine would not disapprove of you," Mr. Collins replied gravely. "When I see her again, I shall speak highly of your modesty and other amiable qualities." "Indeed, Mr. Collins, your praise is unnecessary. You must allow me to judge for myself and believe what I say. By refusing your hand, I prevent you from being unhappy. Consider this matter settled." Mr. Collins persisted. "When I next speak to you on this subject, I hope for a more favourable answer. It is the custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application." Elizabeth cried, "You puzzle me exceedingly. How can I express my refusal so you understand?" "Your refusal is mere words, of course. My hand is worthy of acceptance, and my establishment desirable. My connections with the de Bourgh family and your own, along with your small portion, make it unlikely you will receive another offer. I must conclude you are not serious in your rejection." Elizabeth responded, "I assure you, sir, I have no elegance in tormenting a respectable man. I thank you for the honour, but I cannot accept. My feelings forbid it. Can I speak plainer?" "You are uniformly charming," he said awkwardly. "When sanctioned by your parents, my proposals will be acceptable." Elizabeth, realizing further argument was futile, withdrew. If Mr. Collins persisted, she would appeal to her father, whose decisive negative could not be mistaken for the affectation of an elegant female. Chapter 20. Marriage Plans and Misunderstandings. Mr. Collins didn't waste no time wallowing in silence after figuring out he'd actually won the heart of a lady, not when Mrs. Bennet was practically tripping over her own feet to rush into the room, all eager to pat him on the back, and herself too, for the hand they'd both played in getting him hitched to her daughter. He was all smiles, grateful for the hearty congratulations, and quick to share every little detail of how he'd gotten to that point. Now, he thought the whole thing had gone splendidly, attributing Elizabeth's no to her shy nature and fine upbringing. But that notion near about gave Mrs. Bennet a heart attack. She'd hoped her girl was playing hard to get, not slamming the door shut. She was quick to assure Mr. Collins, bless his heart, that she'd set Lizzie straight right away. "That girl doesn't know what's good for her," she declared, "but I'll sure as sunshine change her mind." Mr. Collins, catching on that Lizzie might really mean her nose, wondered aloud if maybe he ought to reconsider. A wife that stubborn might not exactly be a blessing. But Mrs. Bennet, flustered, insisted Lizzie was only stubborn when it came to matters of the heart, and was otherwise as sweet as peach pie. Not giving him a chance to argue, she dashed off to fetch her husband, Mr. Bennet, from his book-filled sanctuary, hollering about needing to get Lizzie to the altar before Mr. Collins changed his mind. Mr. Bennet, looking up with a serene sort of confusion, took a moment to understand the fuss his wife was making about Mr. Collins and Lizzie, who, it turned out, didn't want each other after all. "And what am I supposed to do?" he asked, seeing the situation as pretty hopeless. "Talk to her yourself. Tell her she has to marry him," his wife pressed. When Lizzie was called down, Mr. Bennet was straightforward. "You turned him down?" he asked. "Well, your mom's dead set on you changing your mind." And so it went, with Mrs. Bennet swinging between cajoling and threatening Lizzie, trying to get her to see sense, while Mr. Bennet and the girls mostly stayed out of it. Mr. Collins, meanwhile, was off by himself, pondering over it all, convinced of his own worth, and utterly baffled by Lizzie's refusal. Amidst all this commotion, their neighbour Charlotte Lucas dropped by, getting roped into the drama the moment she stepped through the door. Mrs. Bennet wasted no time enlisting her help to persuade Lizzie, lamenting how nobody understood her feelings, her poor nerves frayed by the whole ordeal. As the day wore on, Mrs. Bennet held court with Mr. Collins, insisting everyone else hush up while she tried one last time to smooth things over. But it was clear, even with all the talking and planning, hearts weren't set on bending, and the room was heavy with words left unsaid and plans unmade. Chapter 21. Whispers and Wishes. The hullabaloo over Mr. Collins's proposal was finally settling down, but poor Lizzie was still twisted up over the whole mess, not to mention her mamma's fussing didn't help none. Mr. Collins himself was as stiff as a starched shirt, giving Lizzie the cold shoulder and spending his day chatting up Miss Lucas instead, who was kind enough to lend him an ear. The next day didn't bring any relief to the Bennet household, what with Mrs. Bennet's mood, sour as old milk, and Mr. Collins strutting around all high and mighty. Lizzie had been hoping his ruffled feathers might make him hightail it out early, but he stuck to his guns, planning to leave come Saturday just like he'd intended. After their morning meal, the girls headed out to Meryton, curious if Mr. Wickham had come back around and still saw that he missed the Netherfield ball. They bumped into him soon as they hit town, and he confessed to them right there on the street that he'd stayed away on purpose to avoid Mr. Darcy, fearing a dust-up that would have been uncomfortable for more than just him. Lizzie appreciated his thinking, and they spent a good bit of time talking it over as they walked back, him paying her all kinds of attention, which sure didn't hurt his case none. Not long after they got back, a letter arrived for Jane from Netherfield, all fancy with its fine paper and elegant handwriting. Jane's face changed as she read, pondering over the words. She soon tried to jump back into the usual chatter, but Lizzie could tell something was eating at her sister. Up in their room, Jane shared that it was from Caroline Bingley, saying they were all headed to London and didn't plan to come back. Caroline's letter was all sweet talk about missing Jane and keeping in touch, but Lizzie smelled a rat. She reckoned Caroline was just trying to keep her brother away from Jane and didn't mourn their leaving one bit. Jane read out loud Caroline's words about their plans and hopes, which sounded a lot like they didn't expect Mr. Bingley back any time soon. Lizzie's take was that Caroline was up to something, trying to steer her brother toward Miss Darcy and away from Jane, despite what was clear to anyone with eyes that Mr. Bingley was sweet on Jane. Lizzie laid it out plain for Jane. Caroline was likely worried her brother was too taken with her, and by trying to match him with Miss Darcy, she was aiming to keep their social circles tight. Jane hoped for the best, wanting to believe Caroline was just mistaken, not mean. Lizzie, ever the protective sister, wasn't having any of it, and told Jane she ought to stand firm. They decided to keep the news of the Bingleys' departure light when telling their mamma, not wanting to stir up a fuss. Even so, Mrs. Bennet took on about it something fierce, bemoaning the bad timing. Despite her worries, she comforted herself with thoughts of Mr. Bingley's eventual return and planned a grand dinner to welcome him back. Chapter 22. Practical Arrangements. The Bennets were all set to dine over at the Lucas place. Throughout the day, Miss Lucas was real kind, keeping Mr. Collins entertained. Lizzie took a moment to thank her. "It keeps him in good spirits," she said, "and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it." Charlotte, ever the good friend, brushed it off, saying she was glad to be helpful and it was no bother at all. But Charlotte was playing a deeper game than Lizzie knew. She was steering Mr. Collins her way to keep him off Lizzie's back. Her plan worked better than she hoped. That evening, feeling pretty confident about her move, she nearly thought she had him in the bag. But Charlotte underestimated Mr. Collins's determination. The very next morning, he slipped out early and headed straight to Lucas Lodge to declare his feelings, avoiding any prying eyes that might guess his intentions. He got to Charlotte's without anyone seeing him and made his grand speech. Charlotte played it cool, meeting him out as if by chance, but inside she was all astir. In no time at all, they settled things between them, and Mr. Collins was asking her to set a wedding date. Charlotte didn't set a date right then, but she wasn't about to mess around with the man's hopes. Mr. Collins was about as dull as dishwater, but Charlotte wasn't looking for excitement. She wanted stability, and with him, she'd have it. Her folks were over the moon about it, since Mr. Collins was set to come into a nice piece of land eventually, and that meant security. Sir William and Lady Lucas didn't waste any time giving their blessing. They started counting the days until Mr. Collins would inherit, and making plans for all the fine doings they expected to follow. The younger Lucas girls were tickled pink, thinking they might get to come out early with Charlotte married off, and the boys were just relieved there'd be no spinster sister in their future. Charlotte kept her cool through it all. She had snagged herself a husband, which was what she was after. She wasn't much moved by romance or Mr. Collins's charms, but he was her ticket to a secure future. The hardest part was knowing her decision would shock Lizzie, who valued their friendship and might not understand her practical reasons. Charlotte decided to break the news to Lizzie herself, making Mr. Collins promise to keep Mum until she had the chance to talk. That evening, as he was saying his goodbyes, Mr. Collins nearly spilled the beans, eager to brag about his good fortune, but he managed to keep a lid on it, promising to visit again soon, much to Mr. Bennet's dismay. The next morning, Charlotte came over to spill the beans herself. Lizzie was floored, blurting out her shock before she could stop herself. Charlotte wasn't fazed, knowing this would be a tough pill for Lizzie to swallow. "Why are you so surprised, Eliza? Did you think Mr. Collins couldn't charm any lady just because he didn't charm you?" Charlotte said, keeping her cool. Lizzie pulled herself together and tried to be supportive, telling Charlotte she just wanted her to be happy. Charlotte assured her she knew what she was doing. She wasn't looking for a love story, just a comfortable life. And with Mr. Collins, she figured she'd do as well as anyone could expect. After a bit of an awkward chat, Charlotte headed out, and Lizzie was left to chew over the news. It was a tough one to swallow. Lizzie knew they didn't see eye to eye on marriage, but she hadn't expected Charlotte to settle quite so easily. The thought of her friend married to Mr. Collins was a bitter pill indeed, and it pained Lizzie to think of Charlotte settling without a scrap of real affection. Chapter 23. Tangled Ties and Tossed Plans. Lizzie was sitting around with her mamma and sisters, still trying to wrap her head around Charlotte's news, when Sir William Lucas himself showed up with a big announcement. He was all smiles, proud as could be about tying their two families together. He laid it out plain, but his news landed like a sack of potatoes on a quiet porch. Mrs. Bennet, never one to mince words, told him flat out he must be mistaken. Lydia, always quick to stir the pot, blurted out, "Good Lord! Sir William, are you pulling our leg? Everyone knows Mr. Collins was after Lizzie." Sir William kept his cool, though. Polite as ever, he stood his ground, insisting he was right, even as they peppered him with doubts and disbelief. Lizzie, feeling a mix of embarrassment and duty, stepped in to back up Sir William, telling them Charlotte had already shared the scoop with her. She tried to hush her family's fuss and offered her congratulations, with Jane chiming in with kind words about the match and the good character of Mr. Collins. As soon as Sir William left, Mrs. Bennet let loose, ranting about how it couldn't be true, how Mr. Collins must have been tricked, and praying the match would fall through. She was convinced Lizzie had somehow stirred up this mess, and she felt downright wronged by everyone involved. Mr. Bennet was more tickled than troubled, amused to find out Charlotte was just as capable of foolishness as anyone else. Jane was a bit taken aback by the news, but mostly just hoped for their happiness. Kitty and Lydia couldn't have cared less. Mr. Collins was just a clergyman after all, and the news was nothing more than a juicy tidbit to share around town. Lady Lucas was having a field day with the news, making sure to drop by more often just to rub it in to Mrs. Bennet, who couldn't hide her sour grapes. Between Lizzie and Charlotte, things got awkward fast. They barely spoke about the engagement, and Lizzie felt like their friendship had hit a wall. Disappointed in Charlotte's choice, Lizzie found herself leaning more on Jane, especially with Mr. Bingley gone and no word of his return. Jane did her best to handle her mamma's constant griping and hopeful fantasies about Mr. Bingley's return, which everyone else in Meryton seemed to think wasn't happening any time soon. Mr. Collins sent a letter full of gratitude and couldn't help but gush about his joy with Charlotte, even hinting at coming back soon, thanks to Lady Catherine pushing for a quick wedding. When Mr. Collins did show up again, his welcome wasn't quite as warm as before. He was too caught up in his love life to notice much, spending most of his time over at Lucas Lodge, and Mrs. Bennet was stewing the whole time. Every mention of the engagement set her off, and seeing Charlotte only made things worse. She was sure Charlotte was just waiting to take over everything once Mr. Bennet was out of the picture. Mrs. Bennet kept fretting about the entail, and how it seemed unfair that Mr. Collins would get everything, leaving her and her daughters with nothing. Mr. Bennet tried to soothe her, but she was having none of it, too caught up in her worries about the future. Chapter 24. Shaken Hopes and Quiet Resignations. Caroline Bingley's letter hit the mailbox and sealed the deal. They were all hunkered down in London for the winter. The first line was a polite nod to their Hertfordshire friends, that her brother regretted skipping out without a proper goodbye. Jane's fleeting hope fizzled out completely with that opening. As she read on, the letter didn't offer much solace, just a lot of gushing over Miss Darcy and hints at her brother's deepening ties with her. Lizzie got the lowdown from Jane soon after, and it left her stewing in silent frustration, torn between worry for her sister and a growing resentment toward those London schemers. Caroline's insinuations about her brother and Miss Darcy didn't fool Lizzie for a second. She saw right through it, angered by Mr. Bingley's lack of spine, letting his highfalutin friend steer his life and trample his own happiness. And Jane's too. Jane held on to her composure for a couple of days before she could talk about her bruised feelings. With their mamma out of earshot, fussing over Mr. Bingley and Netherfield more than usual, Jane finally opened up. "Oh, if only mamma could hold herself together a bit better. She doesn't realise how much her words sting," Jane sighed, but quickly added, "I can't let it bother me too much. This will pass. He'll fade from my mind, and things will go back to how they were." Lizzie gave her a look full of concern, but bit back her words. Jane noticed and coloured a bit. "You don't believe me, but really, you shouldn't worry. He'll just be a fond memory. That's all. Thankfully, there's no real harm done, and no hard feelings to nurse." "My dear Jane," Lizzie burst out, "you're just too sweet. Sometimes I think I haven't appreciated you enough." Jane brushed off the praise, tossing it back to Lizzie's caring nature. Lizzie tried to push back. "You always see the best in everyone, Jane. It's not fair that you should hurt like this over folks who probably don't deserve your kindness." Jane hoped Lizzie would see things differently in time, especially about Charlotte's odd match with Mr. Collins, which Lizzie just couldn't fathom. "To keep peace, I'll try to believe it's all for the best, but Jane, no one who really values herself could think Mr. Collins a good match. And Charlotte, well, it's a puzzle." Jane argued softly, hoping time would prove their friends happy, but Lizzie was sceptical, especially about Mr. Bingley's sister and friend guiding his choices. "You think too well of them, Jane. They might not just be looking out for his happiness. There could be more selfish reasons." Jane wanted to believe in the goodness of their intentions, but Lizzie wasn't convinced. I hate to say it, but people are often led by less noble aims. Their conversation wrapped up with Lizzie biting her tongue to keep the peace, and Jane clinging to her gentle view of the world. Mrs. Bennet, meanwhile, kept harping on about Mr. Bingley's return, while Mr. Bennet teased Lizzie about finding her own romance amid the local officers, suggesting she make Mr. Wickham her target for a light-hearted heartbreak. "Thanks, but I'll pass on that sort of excitement," Lizzie quipped back, knowing her mother would indeed make a drama out of any disappointment. As days passed, Wickham's presence helped lighten the mood for everyone except Jane, who held on to her quiet hopes and gentle forgiveness for all involved, even as the rest of the neighbourhood decided Mr. Darcy was about as charming as a snake. Chapter 25. Hope and Family Ties. After a sweet week filled to the brim with heartfelt promises of love and dreamy plans for a future as bright as a Texas sunrise, Mr. Collins found himself reluctantly pulled away from his dear Charlotte by the unavoidable arrival of Saturday. Yet the sting of their parting was softened somewhat by his bustling preparations to welcome his bride-to-be into his life for good. He harboured high hopes that soon after his return to Hertfordshire they'd pin down the day destined to crown him the happiest man alive. With a seriousness as thick as molasses, Mr. Collins bade farewell to his kin at Longbourn. He repeated his well wishes for health and happiness to his lovely cousins, and assured their papa of another letter brimming with gratitude. Come Monday, the Bennet household buzzed with the arrival of Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife, who, true to tradition, were there to celebrate Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a man of good sense and manners, a cut above his sister by both nature and nurture. The ladies of Netherfield would have found it hard to swallow that a man who made his living in trade, so close to his own warehouses, could exhibit such refined charm and likeability. Mrs. Gardiner, quite a few springs younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was blessed with both brains and beauty, making her a darling among the Longbourn nieces, particularly the eldest two. Upon arrival, Mrs. Gardiner wasted no time in handing out gifts and updating everyone on the latest fashions from the city. Once the excitement settled, she shifted gears to a listener, as Mrs. Bennet had a laundry list of complaints to air. The family had been through the ringer since her last visit. 2 of her daughters had nearly made it down the aisle, but alas, it all came to naught. "I can't fault Jane," Mrs. Bennet vented. for Jane would have snagged Mr. Bingley if she could have. But Lizzie, oh, it pains my heart to think she could have been Mrs. Collins by now if not for her own stubbornness. He proposed right in this room, and she turned him down flat. Now, Lady Lucas will see her daughter married before mine, and the Longbourn estate is just as tangled in entailments as ever. The Lucases are crafty, always angling for what they can get. It's a shame to speak ill of them, but it's the gospel truth. It rattles my nerves something fierce, being crossed like this in my own family, and having neighbours who put themselves first always. But having you all come by now is a blessing, and I'm tickled to hear about them long sleeves. Mrs. Gardiner, already clued in by the girls' letters, gave a brief nod, and taking pity on her nieces, steered the conversation elsewhere. Later, alone with Elizabeth, she delved deeper. It might have been a fine match for Jane, she mused. Such a shame it fell through. But these things are as common as cactus in Texas. A young man falls hard and fast, and just as quick, he forgets when a bump in the road comes along. Elizabeth appreciated her aunt's take, but noted, "Such comfort is well and good, but it won't patch up our hearts. We don't just suffer from mishaps. It's rare that friends' meddling makes a young man forget a girl he was just head over heels for." And that phrase, head over heels, it's as worn out and vague as an old barn door, tells me nothing solid. It's tossed around more than a salad at a picnic, applied to fleeting fancies as often as to genuine attachments. Just how deep did Mr. Bingley's feelings run? I never saw a clearer case. He was blind to everyone but her. Every meeting left him more enchanted. At his own dance, he snubbed several young ladies, too caught up in her to mind his manners. If that ain't proof enough, what is? Doesn't a touch of rudeness just spell true love? Oh, yes, that's the sort of love he had, all right. Poor Jane, bless her heart. She won't shake this off easy, not with her gentle spirit. It would have been easier on you, Lizzie. You'd have laughed it off sooner. But do you reckon she'd come stay with us a spell? A change of scenery might do her good, maybe ease her mind some. Elizabeth was all smiles at the idea, sure her sister would jump at the chance. I hope, Mrs. Gardiner added, nothing about that young man sways her. We're worlds apart from that scene, barely step out, and it's a long shot they'd cross paths unless he makes a point of it. And that's unlikely, given he's practically tethered to Mr. Darcy. My dear aunt, how could you even think it? Mr. Darcy would barely know Gracechurch Street if it up and introduced itself, let alone visit. You can bet Mr. Bingley doesn't step out without him. All the better. Best they don't meet at all. But doesn't Jane still write to his sister? She won't cut ties that easy. She'll end it, sure as the sun sets. But even as Elizabeth put a firm spin on it, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of hope stirring. Maybe, just maybe, Mr. Bingley's affection could be rekindled, and the meddling of friends might be outmatched by Jane's quiet charm.